Thanks so much. I'm really privileged to be here. I have to say that some of my favorite music teachers in the galaxy are in this district. I've been in elementary classrooms and middle school, especially high school classrooms in this district, and for many years actually, and working with teachers here. So this is one of my favorite places to be, and so it's a real honor for me to be here tonight. I have to say, when Chip asked me to do this, I thought it's a little bit weird to have a music teacher come and talk about the value of the arts, specifically about music, but about the arts. There's something in our world of propaganda and spin that just seems like that's just a dumb decision, right? Like to have a music teacher do it. But I think Chip probably suspected that I'm really passionate about this, and it's something that I do think about a lot. And that's a little bit weird already, because my generation, I was going to say our generation of music teachers, we were not taught advocacy. It's not part of your training as a music teacher to have to defend the value of what you do. It's something that, of course, math, science, and reading teachers never have to think about, right? Because their jobs are secure. But things have changed a lot, and I think younger music teachers now, as part of their, well, I guess it's just in the water, as they are getting their training as music teachers, they are given the bug in their ear that you might have to think about this, right? You may have to defend the value of what you do. So that's something that has really changed. But I have to say, I was really fortunate, even though, as I said, my generation was not trained to think like this. I did have one teacher in college at the University of Wisconsin. I was 20 years old in my first music education class, methods class. And this professor said, I'd like you to for tomorrow, write an essay, one-page essay, on why you think there should be music in schools. And I knew right away that this was a good question. All my classmates were all like, "Rawr, rawr, I just want to teach kids how to play the trombone. I don't want to write essays." But it was a very good discussion we had the next day, because this is what happened. We all write our little papers, right? Kind of our philosophy of music education, which is what he was trying to get us to do. And we shared them as a class, and he sat very nicely and politely listened. And then he said, okay, so let me get this straight. What you guys are telling me is the value of music in school is that it teaches discipline, it teaches perseverance, it teaches kids to work together, like you saw a great example of that here. It teaches kids to stick with their goals, it teaches kids to work hard, all that stuff. So how is that different than volleyball? Dead silence, right? And he said, unless you guys can come up with a better reason for arts education than just all those reasons that just sound like sports or forensics or, frankly, any activity where adults are helping kids to grow into themselves, he said, unless you can come up with a better answer than that, you're not going to be successful in your job. And I remembered that. I mean, I was 20 years old, and I remembered that advice, and it got me thinking. It got me on a path of thinking, why do I do what I do? And I decided tonight, instead of giving a big, broad, first of all, I don't have time for a big, broad anything, just a few minutes, but a big, broad umbrella idea of what is valuable about the arts, because many of you have heard these talks over and over. I'm just going to focus on one small thing. And we'll get to that in just a second. You can see what my title is already. I'm really excited about something that happened 13 days ago. If you've been listening to NPR or in Wisconsin, Wisconsin Public Radio has been talking about this nonstop. There was a study that came out in the Journal of Neural Research. Do you know the one I'm talking about? It came out just last week, and it was by a researcher that's at Northwestern University in the Neuroscience lab there. And it's one of those studies that kind of make music teachers pay attention, right? But this is a little different than all the ones before. It was a study that showed that kids, especially young kids, do better in school if they've had music lessons. Now, to be specific, what they were talking about was 7-, 8-, and 9-year-olds in California, in Los Angeles, who are being given music lessons after school as part of an after-school program. And what they discovered, and this is what made it so great, was that there wasn't much change in their brain patterns after the first year. It was the second year. In other words, neural pathways, they take a while to become established. So how did this show up? Well, they did pretty rigorous research, and they discovered that reading, all the stuff that we care about, right? Reading, language acquisition, ability to focus in class. This wasn't like playing an instrument equals learning how to focus in class. It's like their brains had actually been changed, and they were doing the brain research. And if you go online, you can look actually at the control group and then the kids who had 2 years of this after-school music training. the huge difference in the brainwave patterns and what they were able to discover. And then they track these kids and see that, after so many years, these are the kids that actually succeed in school. Now, what I loved about that was it was one of the first times that it was poor kids, right? It was inner city kids that really have no other advantages, because most of the studies, when people tell me music will boost SAT scores, I'm like, well, duh, right? Anybody whose parents drives them to a lesson every week, those parents are not gonna let them fail on the SAT. I know this, right? Because I've been working with high school kids my whole life. I understand that there's a connection between kids who have parents who care about their future. They're often the ones doing music and art and the things that we care about. They're also the ones that are going to succeed in every way because they've got an infrastructure. But this study, one from last week, was poor kids, right? Who basically their whole neighborhood, nobody's graduating from high school except for these kids. And also, once you see these images, these brain images, and see the difference that playing the flute or playing the trombone, that's what they were doing in their after-school lessons, the difference that it makes, it's pretty powerful. But I'm here to tell you that that's not really what I care about. I love those studies, and I get excited about them, but to me, all they really do is reinforce something that those of us who work in the arts sort of always suspect, and that's that we are complicated creatures. We have a brain and we have a body, but the brain is more than just this biological thing. It's also a mind, right? And a mind is something that's growable, and it's cultural, right? So it's a collection of all the things that it has been exposed to, all the pathways of learning that it has experienced. And it only makes sense to me that whether we're talking about a 3-year-old or an 11-year-old or a high school senior, that the exposure to a wide variety and diverse experiences that the arts provide are, of course, going to open up neural pathways. I think the research is just beginning, and I think we're going to discover that this is true. And actually, Nina Kraus at Northwestern said this, that we know the same thing happens with old people like us, that you can do the same thing. You can start playing an instrument in later life, and new neural pathways will be opened up that will change language acquisition. It will change understanding. It does all kinds of great things for the brain. So I want to talk about a different kind of research that's not that. I want to talk about the kind of research that we who are in the arts basically do every day with kids, right? The things that we have come to believe, those of us who are really paying close attention to what happens to an actual kid in our classroom who's been exposed to a diverse and rich arts education. So I'll start by saying that if you choose for yourself a life of the mind, in other words, that's the kind of future you have in mind, is a life of ideas. That's how I think of myself, as an ideas person. If you think of yourself that way, then of course you're drawn to great minds. And the great minds right now for me are people like Sir Ken Robinson, which if you ever get him to come and do an ArtSpeaks, I'll drive down from Madison again. Sir Ken Robinson or Daniel Pink. Who knows Daniel Pink? Yeah, you gotta know Daniel. And who are my other favorites? Bennett Reamer, the late Bennett Reamer from our own neighborhood here in Chicago. And the one I'm gonna talk about tonight, which some of you may have heard of, I am sad that I never got to meet him because he just died this past year. And I'm gonna flip to the next slide. Can you flip for me? That'd be great. That was actually if you wanted to see the, go back one slide, we should take a look at that. That was the information on the, if you're interested, the Journal of Neuroscience. I forgot that I had a slide. My new hero is Dr. Elliott Eisner, who just died in January. Who's heard of Elliott Eisner? Anybody? So visual art people know him because he actually grew up in Chicago too, but he had been teaching for many years at Stanford University, and wrote about 17 books, if you can imagine. I can't imagine writing 2 books, let alone 17. He was an art teacher. He graduated from the Art Institute here and went to the, taught in the western suburbs of Chicago, and then, like I said, taught at Stanford. His life, though, was not just about art education, it was about how the arts can affect all of education. And I'm just gonna say briefly, he wrote a book, next slide, he wrote a book called The Arts and the Creation of Mind, which, if you're interested in this idea, this is not about scientific research, this is about his own research and how the arts actually change the way a kid or an adult experiences the world. It's quite profound. There's not a single page in this book that is not worth reading by itself. You can just flip open and be like, oh my gosh, this is amazing stuff. But I first became aware of Elliott Eisner, not through this book, but by being in an elementary school, walking down the hall one day, and there was a poster on the wall, and it said this, next slide. It said, 10 Lessons the Arts Teach by Elliott Eisner. Who's seen this list before? So this is an amazing list. We're not going to go through it all, but I can show you a couple of examples. The arts teach children to make good judgments about qualitative relationships. That's actually a really hard one, and he explains it in much more clear detail. But the second one's a little easier. The arts teach children that problems can have more than one answer. Okay, that makes sense. Number 3, the arts celebrate multiple perspectives, etc. If you look back at number 2, if you think about how school works, you know that our curriculum in American public schools is very much weighted towards the kinds of classes where there's a right answer, right? They are rule-based. It's very much kids learning what the rules are in this discipline. Just to give you an example, a spelling teacher, for example, is not really interested in creativity, right? Because there are rules, and the discipline involves learning the rules. And that's true of pretty much every subject area. Now, I'm painting in broad strokes because I'm trying to make a point. Of course, good teachers, even of spelling or math or biology or whatever, are always engaging the imagination of their students. But basically, these subjects, and because of our testing culture, they have swung very far toward this. There's a certain amount of data you must memorize, and then you must be able to manipulate this data and work with it. But it's very much built on sequences of rules, whereas the arts are the one place that look more like that other part of life, which is there's sometimes times when there is not just one right answer. There are choices, right? And kids in the arts learn instinctively that it's the question of making the best choice, or making a choice and then figuring out how to work it out and make it happen. That's one good example. So if I was invited to 10 ArtSpeaks, I would do one of these each time. But I just picked an easy one tonight, and I'm just going to show it to you. It's my favorite one currently, and I think it's number 6 up here. The arts teach students that small differences can have large effects. It seems very logical, right? In my youth orchestra and in my boy choir, which I just saw the boys last night, this is when I'm working with boys like ages 8 through 15. That's my niche in our boy choir program. When I work with them, we call this becoming an expert noticer, because the boys all understand what we mean when we say being an expert noticer. It's something that they see painted vividly in our rehearsals, both in the orchestra and in the boy choir, and also they get that this matters for life, right? Now, who has a middle schooler at home? Okay, so maybe it's just me or us, but having a middle schooler in the house, especially a boy, a little expert noticing would go a long ways, right? A little noticing period would go a long ways. So we're always, yeah, you're all laughing because you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's like, really? You had to set that down right there? You couldn't think of a better place to set that down? So expert noticing is what we are about, except we're using the arts to do it, which is a great way to learn this special skill which they are going to use the rest of their life. And I'm just going to use my last few minutes here to talk about this one thing, because you don't need scientific research to, first of all, understand it or to prove it. You see it if you teach in the arts. You see it happening right before your eyes, whether it's third graders or especially middle schoolers or high school kids. So let's talk about being an expert noticer. I am of the belief that most people are walking through life, most people, including myself sometimes, kind of zombified, right? Kind of asleep, because life is so fast, we are so busy, and there is so much stuff coming at us, and we have so much to attend to that we're essentially asleep a lot. We are not tuned into the world around us. We are not tuned into the richness of it. We are just sort of getting by, and our eyes are set about this far ahead. And just as a thought experiment, this is Elliott Eisner's idea, I'd like you to think about the front door of your house or apartment and picture it in your mind. How much detail of your front door can you recreate in your mind right now, besides the color and which side the doorknob is on? I'm guessing probably not very much, unless you just painted it like in the last week or something like that. And why is that? Because we are not tuned in to things like that, right? We're not tuned in to noticing things because we're used to taking in a much bigger picture. Like we notice when our house needs paint, right? Or we notice when the window's broken, or why are the eaves totally all filled with leaves? What's the deal here? We notice stuff like that because we are tuned into things that have to be solved. But mostly we are not tuned into that level of detail. That's just one little example of that. I realize this when I go to an orchestra concert with somebody who's not really trained to listen to an orchestra. Their attention span is about 3 minutes, and that's if it's exciting and loud and fast. And why is that? Because to them, it just all sounds like music, right? They just say, it's just all music, because they don't have any tools to be an expert noticer of any of the small details. And so it really does just seem like, I don't know, like lots of things in life where it's just one big thing and there's no detail. And I realized this as a young, as a 16-year-old, my first job was as a tour guide at, of all places, the Cave of the Mounds in Blue Mounds, Wisconsin, right? Where I took people through a cave and had my first chance to teach with, not with a microphone, but with a flashlight, right? Where I was pointing things out. Because most people would just walk in, their first impression would be like, whoa! And then after that, it's like they didn't see anything, right? I had to point things out, like, look up there, that's a 6-foot cephalopod fossil. And people would be like, I never would have seen that. Well, that's my job, right? As the tour guide, is to point those things out. I was, for just 50 minutes, with each group of tourists, teaching them to be an expert noticer, or at least getting them started on the path, realizing that it's not just a big rocky hole in the ground. There's lots of cool stuff in here. And having someone point that out. This is now what I do professionally as a music teacher, right? Is I'm still holding a flashlight, except it's a baton, and I'm still pointing out to kids details that they would just miss. I do it with grown-ups too, and it's one of my thrills in life is helping people to take this wash of sound that people say, it all sounds the same, that orchestra music, and say, oh, no, 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 no. Let me give you some tools for becoming an expert noticer, and pulling out some details and becoming more attuned to the details. You'll notice this if you go to an art museum and you watch how people take in a piece of visual art. If they're having some patience for it, they'll step back and see the whole big thing, right? And then they'll go up close because they'll want to look at something really close, and then they'll study that little detail, and then they will step back and take in the whole thing again. That's what we do when we are really engaged and having a little moment of expert noticing. We're sort of going back and forth between the big gestalt, the big picture, and then the little details. A friend on our staff with the Elgin Youth Symphony Orchestra sent me a blog post that just made me laugh, and I've read it over and over and over. It was from a typographer who had someone, I guess that's somebody who sets type, right? Or who like does graphic design, designs type, right? And so that's like a niche world that I didn't even know about. It's like kind of the secret world. Anyway, someone wrote him a question, and they said, essentially what they said is like, wow, you are really meticulous with your work. Would you describe your work as an obsessive attention to detail? Is it indeed an obsession? And if so, why does this particular discipline require this level of engagement? That seems like a fair question, right? Like, wow, you're really obsessed with detail. I almost called this talk tonight Obsessed with Detail. Okay, this was his answer. It's in bold and capital letters. He wrote, wrong question. And then I love this. Every craft requires attention to detail. Whether you're building a bicycle, an engine, a table, a song, a typeface, or a page, a web page, I think, the details are not the details. They make the design. Concepts don't have to be pixel perfect, right? The big idea, that doesn't matter. You can have a big idea. But even the fussiest project will start with a rough sketch. But building something useful that's going to be used by other people, be they drivers, riders, readers, listeners, users everywhere, it needs to be built as well as it can be. And unless you are obsessed by what you're doing, you will not be doing it well enough. Typography appears to require a lot of detail, but so does music, so does cooking, so does carpentry, not to mention brain surgery. Sometimes only the experts know the difference, but if you want to be an expert at what you are doing, you will only be happy with the result when you've given it everything you have. Now, I see a lot of people nodding their heads because they're like, yeah, that's what I want for my kids, right? That level of quality of work. I'm standing here basically to say that I think the arts are the best teacher of that kind of attention to detail. His last sentence was my favorite. Inherent quality is part of absolute quality. And without it, things will appear shoddy. The users may not know why, but everyone will always sense it. So there's a case for being obsessive about details, which evidently to the blog writer is an oxymoron, right? There's no such thing as being obsessive, because if you care about the quality of anything, you're going to care about the details. A couple examples of why I think this matters, and then we'll look at an example of it before we say goodbye. I think that this kind of teaching, this kind of arts teaching, creating little expert noticers, first of all, it makes them curious, right? Which is really important to me because, I'm going to quote Elliott Eisner, the purpose of education is not to finish something, it's to start something. The purpose of a teacher in a classroom is not to cover the curriculum, it's to uncover it. And I think this really matters. I used to be one of those people who thought of teaching as like giving kids as much stuff, like they were containers and you just cram as much into them. I still think a lot of people think that way. I think legislators feel that way. I think people who say 2 math classes are good, but 3 are better. That's the principle, right? The more hours you can spend on any subject area, the better you will be in life. That's the assumption. I don't think that's true anymore. I used to think that. I think what's true now is creating independent, motivated, and curious thinkers, and nothing does this better than the arts do. What else does looking at a detail do? Studying a detail. We'll look at an example in just a second. It helps kids to see the possibilities, right? I love to play this game with kids where we're looking at a musical detail that I have chosen ahead of time among the millions of details in a moment of Brahms or a moment of Bernstein or something like that, and I'll point out this detail, a really genius moment. It could be one note, it could be one little turn of phrase, it could be one change of key, one small detail that they have just glossed over because they're just learning to play the piece or sing it. And I'll point it out, and then I'll say, this is what Brahms did, this is what I would have done, and I'll recompose it right before their eyes and say, this is why Brahms is awesome, right? And this is why I'm not a great composer like Brahms. So that helps kids to see that there are possibilities and that all those many thousands of choices, even in a 2-minute musical piece, are all details that were chosen specifically by the creator of that work. And that makes a huge difference because suddenly their world of possibilities has opened up. Now what happens with a sense of possibilities? That awakens imagination. And let's face it, regardless of what career a kid chooses, they are going to need some imagination, because imagination is what leads to innovation, and that's a word, right, that we care about now. And innovation is the only way that progress happens, and it's the only way our culture stays not only competitive, but stays alive, right? Without imagination, innovation, and progress, we fail as a culture, we fall apart. But imagination, it's not just something that just happens, right? I won't even really get into that. I do wish that there were more subject areas where the imaginative side of the discipline was awakened. I mean, I've seen imaginative math teachers, right, who realize that there's a discipline to higher level of math. I have some friends that have math PhDs. They keep reminding me that it's more like music than I think. And I'm like, not the way I see it in our school, but this idea that there are ways to use imagination in all the subject areas, we still do it the best, I think, in the arts, because kids see that's the whole point, is the amount of possibilities. And it's being an expert noticer that shows us that. Also, the idea of interpretation, right? Oftentimes, and you'll see this in just a second, oftentimes it's a small detail when we stop and step back and then look at it and say, why is it like that? Why did the composer or the painter or the poet, whatever artist created it, why did they choose that? And suddenly, we are forced to have to live with interpretation, right? Asking why. I still think that asking the why is the most important thing, whether we're teaching kids to play Twinkle on their first day of, of violin lessons or whatever, or whether we're looking at Brahms' Symphony. Looking at a detail and asking why it's there suddenly opens up our understanding of what all is possible and what was intended, or what might have been intended. It also teaches kids about ambiguity, right? Because rarely in a classroom of mind does everybody agree on what the point of that detail is. And of course, that's the whole point of the arts, to engage us in a dialogue, so that we are suddenly having to ask questions, and the artwork says, have you thought about this? Have you thought about this? And we're going back and forth. This is what happens in an arts classroom. Okay, let's end with a couple examples, because they're way more fun than hearing me talk in the abstract. So 2 weeks ago, we went to Stratford. Oh, we saw that one already, thank you. And yeah, there we go. Let's just look at this since I sort of skipped over it. This is a summary of what I just said. The arts traffic in subtleties. Paying attention to subtleties is not typically a dominant mode of perception in the ordinary course of our lives. This is Elliott Eisner's words. We typically see in order to merely recognize rather than to explore the nuances of a visual field. And I would say of a sonic field as well, right? All the different sensory perceptions we have, we mostly are just learning to recognize. And I would say, even in some music classrooms, it sort of stops there, right? Where we're just learning to reproduce those notes on the page. But even in that kind of a classroom, there are still gonna be kids who are going to start to entertain the idea of possibilities and that there's more behind these notes than just playing them correctly. Okay, let's go. So, King Lear. We saw this 2 weeks ago in Stratford, Ontario. Has anybody been there? I'm just curious, because we had never been there. This is an amazing place, right? Stratford Shakespeare Festival. So, I'm starting with something really obvious that uses words because it's easy to understand. So the opening of King Lear, a crazy old man, he's about to divide up his kingdom because he's tired of being king. It's like, I'll let my girls run the kingdom. I'm gonna split it into 3. I've got 3 daughters. As it turns out, this is kind of a Jerry Springer family, and he's got 2 daughters that are like horrible and 1 that's perfect, except he can't really tell the difference. So he asks them, he's already decided how he's gonna divide up the kingdom. He asks them in order, oldest to youngest, to tell him how much they love him. Stupid idea, right? And they have to do it publicly. It's like the whole court is assembled, right? So the first daughter, whose name is Goneril, which tells you something about her personality, she makes this speech that it sounds really nice, but everyone's like, ugh, you know, like she's totally making that up. And then her next youngest sister, Regan, does the same thing, and she's like, oh, what she said, even times 2. And then he gets to Cordelia, who's been struggling because she has been saying to the audience's side, I can't do this. Like, I have no idea how to express how I love my father. So he says, now, my youngest girl, our joy, although the last not least, what can you say to draw a 3rd chunk of the kingdom more opulent than your sisters? Speak. And she says one word, nothing. My lord, that's what she says. He freaks out and he's like, nothing? Nothing? Did you say nothing? And then he tries to make a joke, nothing will come of nothing. So we've heard the word nothing 3 times. Well, we're gonna actually hear the word nothing, which doesn't seem very important at this moment when she says it. We're gonna hear it like 11 more times in the show, spoken by various different people in many different contexts until the expert noticer starts to realize like the idea of nothing, actually the idea even of 0, which is kind of a cool new idea in Shakespeare's day, the 0, which is just starting to be used in mathematics education. This is gonna become a theme, right? And it's a theme that you could talk about for weeks, just this idea of what do we mean by nothing? That's one example. It's a very small word, has a huge impact on this great work, but only one word. And it's the kind of detail that would be overlooked, I think, the first time you see or read the play. Another example. One of my favorite paintings by the Swiss Paul Klee. It's called Ad Parnassum from 1932. It's a bunch of tiny squares that were painted on top of other colors. And Parnassum is Mount Parnassus in Greece, which was the mythological home for Apollo and for the Muses. So we look at this, I mean, you're taking it in right now, and I'll give you a quick tour of it. Obviously, there's all these squares of brilliant color, and in this room with this lighting and everything, it's not nearly as brilliant as it looks in real life. It's actually bigger than the size of this projection here. It's a huge painting. Who sees a mountain? Anybody see a mountain? Who sees a pyramid? Who sees a house? So which is it? He doesn't say, right? It's all of those and not anyone in particular. I mean, Parnassus is a mountain. The other thing is, well, obviously there's a sun up there, and then there's this thing that clearly looks like a doorway or a gate, right? One thing I love about this painting is that it's these tiny, tiny magical squares that look like they're floating because they're so iridescent and the color is so beautiful. And they're sort of weighted down by what's very simple, just this straight line, right? And then this shape. But I want to point out one detail and see if you have any sense about why it's here. It's this line right there. Anybody know what that is? Just looking at it, or why it's there? It's such a weird line, right? I don't know why it's there, what's its point in the picture. Anybody want to take a stab at it? Well, I don't know, and that's what makes it cool because it keeps me coming back to this piece. But one thing it does do you see how it makes a pointing down? Can you let's pretend that that's south. Can you find a point going west? The same kind of pointy idea going that way. Yeah, up here, right? And one going east. You see it right here? And one going north. The mountain peak itself. I mean, suddenly I became aware that there are north, south, east, west pointing things. I also realized that they are kind of, for musicians, we know this shape, right? What is that shape? Decrescendo, right? It's no accident Paul Klee was a musician, right? I don't know if he's making visual puns on decrescendo and crescendo there. It's very possible because there's a lot of musical punning going on in here. But the question is not what's the right answer. The question is like, how many times can I keep coming back to this amazing painting and finding a detail that makes me go, I still have to keep thinking about this. I know that the title itself makes me wonder because Parnassus has this whole history attached to Greek mythology and also to musicians who know a famous series of exercises called Gradus ad Parnassum for pianists to play. Okay, that's a lot of small details, but they all add up to this amazing picture. Let's end with a musical example. Those are the hardest ones to understand, and a really cool detail. Here it is. Do you remember how it started? Besides the chuck, 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 chuck right there? Yeah, so this piece has an amazing beginning. Most kids, when they're learning to play it, are just learning to make a beautiful sound, right? But I've always been intrigued by one very small detail, the way the piece begins, because it's very intentional. It begins with just one note. And the piece is so familiar to us in the music world that we forget about a detail like this. Like, what was Barbara thinking, starting with one note? Let's hear it one more time. So I love this note. I love the way it has a sense of possibility, right? The way that the very next sound we hear is the whole orchestra in a chord that kind of fits, right? It's like this note goes out ahead, and everyone else says, we can do something with that and support it. And then immediately, this beautiful consonance changes to a dissonance, where the note that sounded so pure and so sweet and so beautiful suddenly is the wrong note, right? Because everyone else has moved on, and that note that stayed the same now doesn't really work anymore and needs to work itself out with this long, beautiful melody that takes us in a different direction. So that's just an example of something that it's easy to just look past it, but in a good arts classroom, this is what we do, is we take a detail like that, a very small thing, and I hope you'll all listen to Adagio for Strings tonight when you get home. Everybody, every family sit down around the table, listen to it, and talk about that starting note. Why do we do this? I'm going to give you a little hint, because, actually before I do, I just have to show one more slide. It reminds me of these girls. Tolstoy said, not only does examining work like we just did with the Barbara Adagio help us grow in our expert noticing, it's having to perform, having to make small choices, the details that do it. And he explained it this way. It's the same in all the arts, a wee bit lighter. I don't think in Russian they say a wee bit, but this is the translation. A wee bit lighter, a wee bit darker, a wee bit higher, lower, to the right or the left in painting, a wee bit weaker or stronger in intonation, or a wee bit sooner or later in dramatic art, a wee bit omitted, overemphasized, or exaggerated in poetry. And you heard it with the pink notes. Yeah, that was so great. Pink notes, you heard it like, there were like 10,000 moments that they had to decide like that, right? Just to make those pieces work. They made them sound easy, but they're making 10,000 small, nuanced, attention to detail choices that they have learned to do, right? and they're making them quickly on the spot. That's what's amazing about becoming sensitized to these details. So why do I do this? It's because when I look at those 12-year-old boys that I taught last night, I look at a 12-year-old boy. I do not see a 12-year-old boy. I see a future 45-year-old man. And I want that 45-year-old man, when he gets to be 45, not only to have a good career, yeah, I care about that, but I don't want him to have a good career simply so that he can make money and buy stuff, right? Because by age 45, he will have already figured out that there's got to be more to life than this, right? So when he's 12, I want to set him on a course that says the world is a big and rich and wonderful place. And if you become an expert noticer, not only are you going to have more success in finding your passion, finding your career, but the whole world will open up to you, right? That everything becomes richer. You will become attuned to everything, to the aesthetic qualities of a tie, or of a Prius, like I drove down here, or of a building, or of the person you may marry, right? There are aesthetic qualities to many things in life besides just the arts, and that is something that becoming an expert noticer trains us to do, and it widens our scope of how awesome the world is, how rich it is, and this is something that arts does better than no other thing that I know. So, onward. Thank you.